In this half of the lecture, we'll look at the subset of the Gothic known as the Eco-Gothic and consider H.G. Wells's place within it. In response to the new scientific ideas that we considered in part 1 of this lecture, the 19th century produced the first modern apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic fiction. Mary Shelley's The Last Man, published in 1826, follows a family trying to survive in a plague-ridden world. Richard Jefferies' After London, published in 1885, details an England that's been completely reclaimed by nature. Thus, he writes, "As no care was taken with the brooks, the hatches upon them gradually rotted, and the force of the winter rains carried away the weak timbers, flooding the lower grounds, which became swamps of larger size. The dams, too, were drilled by water rats, and the streams percolating through slowly increased the size of these tunnels till the structure burst, and the current swept on and added to the floods below. Mill dams stood longer, but as the ponds silted up, the current flowed round and even through the mill houses, which, going by degrees to ruin, were in some cases undermined till they fell." Here, Jefferies presents human structures as weak, that can be rotted away and overtaken by the more powerful nature. Nature, in a very short space of time, reclaims these human structures into their own natural landscape. So here we have a consideration of what happens when all the people disappear, and Jefferies posits that nature will come back in full force to reclaim this territory. So it becomes a narrative somewhat of kind of like colonial conquest, right? So humanity has taken this territory, and now nature is taking it back from us. These types of books, along with much of Wells's fiction, are part of what Lawrence Mazzino and Ronald Morrison have called Victorian environmental nightmares. They write, "Over the course of the Victorian period, a diverse selection of writers, making use of multiple literary and rhetorical forms, expressed growing fears and concerns over environmental degradation. In some instances, environmental disasters influenced these responses, while in other instances, a growing awareness of the problems caused by industrial pollution and the unprecedented growth of cities prompted responses in imaginative literature. In some instances, Victorian writers projected onto colonial landscapes, or wholly imagined ones in fantastic fiction, their anxieties about how humans might change their environments, and how these environments might change humans." So in some ways we can see this as a corollary to the urban Gothic that we looked at with Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde. That's also a response to the increasing urban population and the increasing size of cities in the 19th century, but that takes the Gothic into that wholly artificial urban environment, whereas the Eco-Gothic, in contrast, considers the conflict between humanity and the environment and what would happen if the natural world won in those cases. So we can trace some of our modern concerns about ecological disaster and human impact on the environment to the Victorian period. And these nightmares, in Mazzino and Morrison's terms, gave rise to what we now call the Eco-Gothic. As Andrew Smith and William Hughes argue in the chapter I asked you to read, in the Eco-Gothic, nature becomes constituted in the Gothic as a space of crisis, which conceptually creates a point of contact with the ecological, in which the key issue is how to find a language which owns the ecological, and so anchor it as a site of coherent meaning. So here we see the fact that nature is outside of human conceptions of meaning, outside of our way of explaining the world. It exists as other to us, and of course we've looked at concepts of the other throughout this course. Here it's the natural world who takes the place of either the racial other or the female other. And so Smith and Hughes suggest that the Eco-Gothic is trying to find a way of expressing nature in human terms, which would be a kind of, again, conquest or colonizing. It's a way of taking ownership over the ecological, over the environmental, by expressing it in these human terms. They therefore suggest that nature should be taken as a key site of the Gothic, alongside the castle and the convent, which similarly reproduces hierarchical power relations and their violent consequences. In most of these novels, they argue, The desecration of the natural world is met with psychological trauma and can usually be traced to an oppressive ruling power, a structure which mirrors modern conceptions of a feminized nature attacked by a patriarchy, technology, industry, or even society itself. So, like the female Gothic that we've looked at before on this module, the Eco-Gothic serves as a critique of those oppressive ruling powers and the hierarchical structures of society itself. The Eco-Gothic, like the female Gothic, can therefore detail the nightmarish consequences of unrestrained tyrannical power, like the breakdown we see the narrator have at the end of the yellow wallpaper. But again, like the female Gothic, the Eco-Gothic can also serve as a fantasy in which those power structures are upended or overthrown or inverted, demonstrating to those in control that their hegemony is not as secure as they previously thought. J.M. Ong therefore argues that Wells both reveals how anthropogenic activity, made possible through colonization, creates nightmare environments characterized by ecologically unstable relationships, and also questions the dominant Victorian views of science and empire as narratives of conquest, advancement, and control by revealing their counter-developmental and connected effects, which can and do lead to species extinction. It's the very tyrannical actions of the empire, therefore, that cause its own destruction, right? It brings this destruction upon itself. And this is evident in a story like The Sea Raiders that we read this week, which enacts the basic plot of the reverse colonization novel that we saw in Dracula, but with animal invaders instead of a supernatural monster. Like Jonathan Harker at the beginning of Dracula, the main character of the Sea Raiders, Fizzin, is absolutely convinced of his own superiority, as well as the safety that it seems to guarantee. Thus, we are told, he approached his mark with all the assurance which the absolute security of this country against all forms of life gives its inhabitants. And like Harker, Fizzin is confronted with superior creatures, superior here in strength at least. We're given very little explanation for the appearance of these carnivorous cephalopods on the coast of England, but we are told zoologists are altogether at a loss to account for its sudden appearance on our coast. Possibly it was the stress of a hunger migration that drove it hither out of the deep. This gives us the briefest suggestion that human activities may have led to this ecological crisis. Something has deprived these cephalopods of food, driving them to new territories to feed. In some ways, this is the exact plot of the 2013 movie Sharknado, in which the presence of the sharks in the tornado is attributed to both the illegal trade in shark fins as well as climate change, which impact the migration patterns of the sharks. In both Sharknado and The Sea Raiders, humanity creates the very circumstances that lead to their own demise, and are then confronted with the fact that they are not, in fact, apex predators. What Fizzin realizes, as soon as he gets close to the cephalopods, is that his security is not based on personal superiority, but on the achievements of the whole of the human species. A single human pitted against a single one of these creatures does not stand a chance. And again, we can trace similarities to Dracula and the other reverse colonization novels of the period. It is the activities of the empire which draw these foreign powers to our shores. The expanding empire has demonstrated to Dracula the appeal of London. It's introduced him to modern British culture, and it's made him wish to conquer us. If we hadn't gone into his territory first, he wouldn't have come into ours. Similarly, with the cephalopods, if we hadn't gone into their deep sea territory first, they wouldn't have come to our coast. And Wells makes it quite clear in his non-fiction essay on extinction that, as in the reverse colonization novel, this is just our own destructive activities revisited upon us. He writes, "In the last 100 years, the swift change of condition throughout the world, due to the invention of new means of transit, geographical discovery, and the consequent swarming of the whole globe by civilized men, has pushed many an animal to the very verge of destruction. It's not only the dodo that has one. For dozens of genera and hundreds of species, this century has witnessed the writing on the wall." And we can see here that Wells, in the language he uses, breaks down the separation between humanity and animals that we talked about in the first part of this lecture. So these aren't two distinct categories. The humans have swarmed the whole globe. This is the same kind of language he uses in the Empire of the Ants, the swarming insects teeming over everything and taking over. And similarly, humanity has swarmed the earth and weaker animals have suffered the consequences. As Ong explains, Wells expresses a concern that colonial expansion and associated economic globalization might not always work to benefit the British Empire. Wells not only looks towards the end of British dominance, but also signals how the deadly effects of colonialism may turn upon the colonizers themselves. In this chapter, Ong points to the ways in which empire does not simply exploit the natural resources of the places it conquers, but also irrevocably harms those new landscapes through the introduction of invasive species of animals and plants. British citizens settling in places like South Africa, India, or Australia did not just bring themselves to these new places, but also brought pieces of home in the form of British plants and animals. The success of these species, like rabbits in Australia, were celebrated at the time as further evidence of the superiority of all things English. Even our animals and plants easily took possession of these new lands. Of course, what we understand today is that these species flourished not because they were superior, but simply because they were new. With no natural predators, as a native species might have, they were able to run rampant. Thus, while Wells suggests in Empire of the Ants that the ants have been evolving, growing more intelligent and learning to use tools and technology, he demonstrates in the flowering of the strange orchid that this kind of advancement is not necessary to bring destruction to England. Simply transplanting something that doesn't belong, as the British Empire did all over the world, can have disastrous consequences. Thus, the orchid is able to overpower Wedderburn simply because, like the main character in the Sea Raiders, he doesn't know to be worried about it. And just as Empire transported animals and plants abroad, they brought species from abroad back home, turning the disastrous consequences of transplantation back on themselves. Anyone who struggled to remove Japanese knotweed from their garden or mourned the loss of the red squirrel in favor of the sturdier grey has experienced the consequences of the 19th century British Empire's introduction of non-native species to this country. Across all three stories, Wells warns about the British assumption of superiority and the careless effects that the empire has on both the natural world abroad and at home. Overfishing might bring hungry predators looking for new sources of food. Venturing into parts of the world that humans have no dominion over might unleash new threats. And even bringing home a beautiful flower can have unforeseen consequences. We live in a world now where the effects of even the smallest of our decisions are apparent to us. Yet it's also important to note that Wells makes it clear that it's the most vulnerable populations that will suffer these consequences first. The children in the boat in the Sea Raiders, the native population in the Empire of the Ants. We can, therefore, look to these stories not just for reminders of the environmental impact of all human actions, but also as a reminder of the dangers of the more extreme forms of environmentalism. You've probably all seen some version of tweets that look like this in the recent weeks, as much of the world goes into lockdown because of coronavirus. Yet this notion that the earth is healing at our expense is a clear example of eco-fascism. Eco-fascists, at first glance, seem to express many of the beliefs all environmental activists hold. They, in the words of one anonymous eco-fascist, put the well-being of our earth, nature, and animals on the forefront of their ideology, turning away from industrial and urbanite society. As the New Statesman notes, this is a seemingly benign focus. Yet the people who post the memes of dolphins in the Venice canals, who claim that humans are a virus and COVID-19 is the cure, are deeply rooted in alt-right ideologies. The people they are so ready to sacrifice to cure the earth are always the most vulnerable. Those who are suffering from the current pandemic, but very often also non-white third world populations who end up bearing the blame for overpopulation in this kind of ideology. Thus, the New Statesman reminds us that many eco-fascists are also eugenicists, who believe that a culling of the population, and specific races within that population is the only way to ensure that the planet survives. Here again, we can trace roots in 19th century science. Eugenics, or the social engineering of the human population, was a late Victorian idea. As a member of the scientific community that included the founders of eugenics, like Francis Galton, Wales was not entirely free of these ideas. And so, while we can read these stories and celebrate the prescient environmentalism that drives their plots, we must remember that the idea of nature rising up against mankind is presented as a nightmare, not a desirable outcome.